I'm Larry Rosin. I'm president of Edison Research, and I'm very pleased to present the results of the Infinite Dial 2018 for Australia. I'm back from a visit to your fair country over the last several weeks, where I presented this data to quite a number of ad agencies and also some radio companies, and attached to that a wonderful holiday where my wife and I ran around much of the eastern side of your country, including getting into the center, the Uluru. So we absolutely loved it and had such warm hospitality. I want to go out of my way and make sure that I thank the three sponsors of the Infinite Dial, each of them. First, Commercial Radio Australia, who has really been a driving force behind a lot of this and arranged for much of the the business end of the visit to Australia that I did, and they've been quite a pleasure to work with. Particular shout out needs to go to Podcast One and more broadly SCA, and for their continued support of this project, and most especially to John Musgrove, who runs research at SCA, who this whole project would not have happened without, and he has been really the key player in making Infinite Dial Australia happen. And then last but certainly not least, our good friends at Triton Digital. And it's very fair to say that the whole of Infinite Dial around the world would not be happening without the tremendous support and partnership with Triton Digital, who are the primary partners here in North America, both for the USA Infinite Dial and for Canada. And so, again, I want to thank all three for coming together and supporting this initiative and helping us provide this information for Australia. Let's see if I can make this work. There we go. So as a quick overview, what the Infinite Dial is a survey that we've been doing here in the United States annually for the last 20 years. And it's really the longest running survey of its kind, tracking digital media consumer behaviors here. So this year was the 20th year we've done it. And the Infinite Dial Australia report sort of mirrors what we've done in the United States. And so it allows us to both look at the results in Australia and compare those results to the United States. And this is the second year we've done it in Australia. So you'll see a lot of tracking information, how last year compares to this year. And as I mentioned briefly already, this year we will have 3 layers of comparison. We also launched Infinite Dial Canada this year. And so on certain graphs, you'll see comparisons across the 3 English-speaking countries. And we are in discussions in other territories as well to try to expand the global footprint of Infinite Dial so that more countries can have these same comparisons. In terms of what we did, it's based on a national survey of Australians 12 and over, a little bit over 1,000. It's done to all the gold standard measures of how research should be done. Some people are curious why 12. I know your rating system is at 10. The reason we use 12 in Australia is because we use 12 in the United States. And so in order to have same-to-same comparisons, we just use the same age range for this presentation. And so the data is appropriately weighted to represent the full population of Australia. So this is a national survey, a question I got quite a number of times. It's not just metros or just regional Australia, it's all of Australia is being represented by this sample. So let's start by looking at some data about radio, and radio, as we would say in America, simulcast. And the first question, just straight up, did you listen to any broadcast radio in the last week? And so the number on top is the number we got last year, 85%, and this year it went up to 88%. And so a very, very strong percentage. We actually tweaked the question this year to mention DAB plus as well as just over-the-air and online forms of broadcast radio. So that probably accounts for the little bump up in the numbers year on year. But no matter how you slice it, the percentage of Australians who say that they are listening to the radio is extremely high. And you will get a sense for just how high that is if we compare the result to what we see in the United States. So a robust number, a high number for the United States, 2/3 of all Americans, over the phone telling you that they'd listened to the radio in the last week in our infinite dial survey of the United States, but a much higher number. There's that 88% for Australia. So one of the themes you will see throughout this presentation is that radio is strong in the United States, but it's yet stronger in Australia, and that will be somewhat consistent throughout these findings. But the world is changing, radio is changing, and the reason we do this study is to measure those changes. And let's take a look at one of the things that shows how things are changing. We asked this question both last year and this year: how many radios do you have in your home? And you see that on the right-hand side of the screen, you see that the average number of radios that people have in their home last year was 1.7 radios. This year just barely changed down to 1.6 radios on average. But the numbers that I want to call your attention to in particular are over on the left-hand side of this graph. And that is, last year, 21% of Australians said they had no radios in their home, and 24% this year, so a little bump up this year. And this year we actually asked also about DAB plus radios, and even then that percentage went up a little bit. And so that doesn't mean for a second that people don't listen to radio at home. It just means that they are not necessarily listening on a radio. And that's one of the main, I think, points of this survey and distinctions, is that we're seeing this separation between the content that radio creators are creating and making and distributing, and the mechanisms by which that is being consumed. And that is one of the biggest things that is changing, is in terms of how people are consuming the content, and that those two worlds are sort of splitting: radio as software, what people can listen to, and hardware, that piece of machinery called a radio that people might be listening on. That you'll get a sense for that number in that 24%. That percentage is even higher here in the United States. So 29% in America saying they don't have a single radio in their home. Interestingly, the average is the same. We had a few more people in the States with very high numbers of radios in their home. So the average came out the same over on the right. But that yellow percentage, people saying they don't have a single radio in their home, is even higher in the United States. If you isolate 18 to 34-year-olds, the number gets much higher yet. It's up to 50% of Americans 18 to 34 saying they don't have a radio in their home. And so again, you get a sense for how things are changing. But again, not having a radio in your home doesn't mean you don't listen to radio. Here we ask the question: do you ever use a mobile phone, computer, or TV to listen to the radio while at home? And fully 21% of Australians say yes, they do that. So they listen to radio at home, not using a radio, but using one of these alternative sources. And much of that 21% is the same people who said that they don't have a radio in their home. So again, a sense for how things are changing. We also asked in general about listening to the streams of broadcast radio in the last month. 14% of Australians over there on the right saying they have listened to radio on stream. The previous question was ever. This question is in the last month. And that number is very comparable to what we see in the United States. So the next thing we'll talk about is audio aggregators. I will pause to mention that we will be posting, this deck is already posted on the Edison website, edisonresearch.com. And I believe it's on the CRA website and Triton websites as well. And I believe Podcast One too. So if anyone wants this deck, it's fully available. You can go to the websites of any of the players and make sure and have the opportunity to download it. So let's look at audio aggregators. We asked both last year and this year just about awareness of these three brands: iHeartRadio, TuneIn Radio, and the radio app. And you see the big change year on year is a significant increase in awareness of iHeartRadio. Last year was 27%. This year it jumps up all the way to 37%. TuneIn just a little bit higher, and the radio app the same percentage year on year. And I believe the radio app is prepping a marketing campaign to try to move that number, but we got the same number each year of the 2 years for that effort. But you do see a big jump up for iHeartRadio. comparing those numbers to the United States, you see really a big difference. So iHeartRadio, the brand, is known to 2/3 of Americans, 67%. And that's a real testament to the power of broadcast radio, mostly. As many of you on this webinar probably know, iHeartRadio is the biggest radio company in America. They changed the name of the company, which was once Clear Channel, to the name of their app in order to stress the importance of the app. If you listen to any of iHeart's 850 radio stations for an hour, you are sure to hear 3 or 4 mentions of iHeartRadio, the app, and encouragement to download the app. And while broadcast radio is not the only avenue that they have used to promote that brand name, iHeartRadio, it is overwhelmingly how it has been promoted. And you see that through all that broadcast radio promotion, they have driven it up to a very high percentage, 2/3 of Americans aware of iHeart. TuneIn Radio, a little bit better known in Australia as compared to the United States, and we have no equivalent really of the radio app in the United States. However, usage of these aggregators to date is quite modest, low single-digit percentages for all three. A nice sized rise for iHeartRadio from 1% to 3%, but in all three cases, while the brand names have some awareness, usage is quite modest to date. Then we looked at various online audio streaming services, and we'll start by just looking at just general online audio consumption. And here we have our first appearance of Canadian data. And just to make things a little bit more confusing, but I want to try to clarify. When I show all 3 countries, you'll see up in the upper left of this graph, it says population 18 plus. For a variety of sort of political, legal reasons, it's extremely difficult to research teenagers in Canada. So in Canada, the survey was 18 plus. So when we're comparing all 3 countries, I'll be showing the 18 plus data. So hopefully that isn't too confusing. So this is the total number of people who say they've listened to online audio in some form in the last month. So this would be a combination of listening to broadcast radio streams or listening to content only available on the internet, like Spotify, or here in the States, Pandora or Apple Music, etc. And so you see a significant portion of Australians say they've done this, 52% over on the right, but you see that number actually trails the percentage in Canada and the United States. There's probably any number of historical and technical reasons that that's the case. There's been a lot more players that have been more aggressive in the United States. I think internet usage and usage through your phone is less expensive in the States than it is in Australia, and there's probably many other reasons as well. But monthly online listening a little bit lower here in Australia as compared to both Canada and the United States. We asked about awareness of these 5 brands this year who are sort of pure plays. Last year, of course, we had Pandora in the Australian study. We continue to track Pandora here in the States. But of course, they exited Australia in the last year, so we don't have that. You can see that there's really 2 well-known players in the space right now, Spotify and Apple Music, both around 3/4 of all Australians aware of that. To try to be as clear as possible, we say Apple Music, the paid music subscription from Apple, to try to reduce people saying yes because they're thinking of iTunes or yes just because they know Apple. But those 2 brands extremely well known, well out ahead of Amazon Music, which we asked about for the first time at 37%, Google Play, All Access, and Tidal getting basically the same results as last year. Those numbers again are quite different from what we get in the States. Spotify, extremely well known in the States, but better known in Australia. Apple Music, same thing, very well known, but better known in Australia. If Pandora were on this graph, Pandora is the best known brand in this category in the States. They're well over 80% product awareness in the United States. But then you see for 2 others, Amazon Music and Google Play All Access, much higher levels of awareness in the United States than in Australia to date. And anyone on this webinar who's spent time in the States knows that the game is on in terms of these 4 brands and Pandora and others. So there's quite a bit of external marketing, digital marketing, all kinds of promotion for these brands. Tidal, which is really having some struggles right now, is equally unknown in both geographies, 10% in both Australia and the United States. So while awareness for Spotify and Apple Music were extremely similar, almost tied, usage is not anywhere close. So Spotify now, in terms of usage in the last week, from 21% to 26%, so a nice big gain, 5 percentage points year on year, and way out ahead of any other option. Apple Music up a point from 6% to 7%, well back in second place, and very small numbers for Amazon Music to date, which I know is new, and Google Play All Access. So Spotify, the overwhelming leader in this category to date in terms of usage in Australia. There's another huge factor in the world of audio, and that is YouTube. Now, some people will argue, well, YouTube isn't audio because they sell their ads against the video space. But one thing I know for sure is that people are functionally using YouTube in many cases as audio. And another thing I know for sure is if people are consuming music from YouTube, they're not also consuming radio or Spotify or anything else, because you can only listen to one thing at a time. So the percentage rose from 44% to 47%. That's 47% of all Australians saying that they've listened to music, specifically music on YouTube in the last week. And we very clearly in the question make it clear that we're not talking about watching other kinds of videos, is specifically for music. So nearly half of everyone in Australia told us they had used YouTube to listen to music or watch music videos in the week before we called them several months ago. What's remarkable about that is that the numbers are so high in all three of these geographies, and those numbers are exactly the same in all three geographies. You get a sense for just how big YouTube is. Pretty much the same percentage in all three countries. Again, this is popping back to the 18 plus number, but huge and big in all three countries. Now, YouTube, this will be a very interesting aspect to the space to track over the next year. Google/YouTube is not always super consistent in their announcements, but it seems to be the case that they are planning to dramatically increase the number of commercials you have to consume, the number of ads, in order to use their free service on YouTube in a announced and clear attempt to push people to a paid subscription. So it's a fascinating strategy. Apparently their goal is to use advertising to kill advertising. And it'll be very interesting to see if indeed they follow through with that and what happens. The other thing is, and again, they're not always super clear in their announcements, but it appears that they plan to phase out the brand name Google Play All Access and consolidate everything under the YouTube brand name, which I personally think seems like a very smart idea because there is confusion and YouTube is a bigger and stronger brand name. But it will also be interesting to see how that goes, merge those sort of two elements of the Google empire into one. So YouTube will really be one to watch in the coming year and one to see how it tracks forward when we do the next Infinite Dial study in 2019. We asked a new question this year about to mobile phone users if they ever use their mobile data allowance to listen to audio on their mobile phone. And more than half of mobile phone users said yes. My understanding is that mobile plans tend to be very expensive in Australia, and people are conscious of not going over their data. And yet still half of people say they've used their data allowance to consume audio. So it does give you a sense for just how powerful audio can be. And I do see the question light is blinking there. If someone has a question, I will at the end try to go through the questions and see if I can respond to any of them. So I do see you there, whoever asked the question, and I will take a look at the end. And if I know the answers, I will happily give them. Of course, the in-car environment is so crucial to the world of audio, and we looked at that. So first we just said, what do you use in your car? This is just, do you ever use in your car? And this was asked to those who drive a car or are a passenger in a car. And you see that the percentage for radio is exactly the same year on year. It was 89% last year, 89% again this year. The big drop is for CD player, dropped 7 percentage points from 59% to 52%. Somebody watching this webinar is amazed to learn that anybody continues to use the CD player in the car. but in fact, more than half of Australians who get in cars continue to use the CD player in the car. That number is dropping. It's going to continue to drop. Car companies want to eliminate CD players from the cars, and some cars are now rolling off the assembly line without CD players in them. So that's going to continue to change. Several people, when I've shown this in the past, have asked about that DAB plus number going down a few percentage points. We're not entirely sure why. It's probably related to just small numbers and more likely related to confusion about, are you listening to AM FM radio or are you listening to DAB plus? And that's probably the bigger factor. But DAB plus is something we'll probably dig into a little bit more deeply next year as it becomes a bigger factor. It's expected to become a bigger factor. Relatively small percentage of Australians saying that they ever listen to podcasts in the car, stream into the car, although that's up a couple points, or listen to the streams of broadcast radio, which of course, why do that when your car has a radio in it? So it's a relatively small percentage. Again, these numbers very different from what we see in the United States. So again, that theme from earlier, radio is strong in the States at 82%, but higher yet, 89% in Australia by comparison. CD players similar. Americans, for whatever reason, more likely to maybe connect their phones and listen to their music files off their phone in the cars. You see 45 to 37. But you see three big differences down on the bottom. So Americans, data plans for mobile phones tend to be much, much less expensive here in the States as compared to Australia. Many people have unlimited data plans or plans that are so generous that they will tell you they wouldn't know how to use all their data even if they tried. Now, of course, they could if they tried, but the point being they've never come close to using all their data. So probably people feel much more free about connecting their phones and streaming into their cars, and that's why we see significantly higher numbers for online audio and podcasts in the States, which obviously you can download podcasts, but in many cases, people are going to stream those if they're in their cars. Then lastly, we have something in the States that you don't have and are unlikely to ever have in Australia, and that's satellite radio. For anyone who doesn't know, there is a satellite or a series of satellites sitting up over North America. Virtually every car that's been sold for the last 7 or 8 years has a receiver baked into it. You can pay $12 or $13 a month, get 100 commercial-free music channels, another 50 speech channels, and significantly, you could get in your car here in New Jersey and drive all the way to Los Angeles and keep the signal the whole way. And so like long-haul truckers have become big target market for this, very successful there. But it's increasingly a factor. In fact, 1 in 5 Americans say that they use satellite radio in their cars. You're never going to get it primarily because it's super expensive to shoot a satellite up over and use this. We have in North America over 350 million people to amortize that over, whereas you guys are sitting at 25 million or so. And it's unlikely that anyone would be able to make the finances work there. And then we asked what do you use most in their car. And here you see that radio is the overwhelming choice, down a couple points from 75% last year to 71% this year. But overwhelmingly, when you say what do you use the most in your car in Australia, people are saying that they use the radio the most. 1 point gain for CDs or your own music, and 1 point gains for each of some of the other things. But still, overwhelmingly, the thing people are using the most in their cars is broadcast radio. And again, this is different from what we see in North America. So that theme, again, radio is super strong in all three places, but strongest in Australia. As you see down on the bottom, the 70% in Australia compared to 63% for radio in Canada and 56% in the States. What's the difference makers? Well, there in red, you see satellite radio, which came to the States first and now is most used by 13% of people, 6% in Canada, where it came a little bit later, and much, much higher for online audio. So again, people streaming Spotify or Pandora, or whatever it might be, in their cars. Moving along here, we looked at some other devices. Do you own a smartphone? 90% of all Australians say yes, they now have a smartphone, up 2 percentage points year on year. Under the age of 55, the numbers are about as high as they can possibly get at this point, and the gain year on year coming from 55 plus. So more parents and grandparents now now over 3/4 of 55 plus with a smartphone in Australia. That number is higher than we have in the United States. So you can see here, we have been tracking the percentage of Americans with a smartphone going back to 2009, and it's gone up every year, although you see the pace of growth, as has to happen, is tapering off. We have a very high 83%, our most recent estimate here in the United States, well surpassed 90% for Australians. So, really, really high smartphone ownership in Australia. Smart speakers is one of the two hottest topics in the world of audio today, and we have our first estimates for this category. We first asked just about awareness of these two brands, Google Home and Amazon Alexa. I know that Amazon Alexa was very new in Australia as of the dates of our survey earlier this year. So 61% know Google Home, 28% know Amazon Alexa. These numbers are extremely different from what we have in the States. So Amazon Alexa had the first mover advantage in America, and you see it has 71% brand awareness in the United States, much higher than Google Home at 56%. And indeed, the awareness of Google Home is higher in Australia than it is in the United States. So a very different picture in the two countries. And we have our first estimate of ownership of smart speakers, and that's 5% of Australians now owning a smart speaker. Our early days on this, and this will be fascinating to track going forward. I like to stress this is a sort of person's estimate. 5% of people say they have a smart speaker. That's not necessarily the same as the number of devices that have been sold, because multiple people in a household would answer yes to having a smart speaker, even if there were one, and one person could live in a household with more than one smart speaker. So either way you look at it, I just want to make it clear it's a person's estimate, and it's 5%. And that number trails Canada and especially the United States. However, this graph is really probably a graph of just how many months, or in the US case, years, these products have been available. I suspect that if we could align the amount of time that these products have been on the market in each of these three countries, the take-up rates would be extremely similar. But Alexa launched several years ago now in the States and is bumped up to 17% of everyone, 18 plus in the States, half that in Canada, and then, as you saw, the first estimate, 5% for Australia. So smart speakers is one of the two hottest topics in audio right now. Podcasting is the other, and we have quite a number of graphs about podcasting in Australia. First, are you familiar with the term podcasting? A significant gain, 6 percentage points. It was high last year. It's even higher this year. 78% of Australians now saying that they're familiar with the term podcasting. It went up, as you can see, in each age group, 12 to 24, 25, 54, and 55 plus. And that number is way higher than we have in the United States. So you see, we've been tracking this all the way back to 2006, familiarity with this term. And you see that it really didn't go up much for many years, from 09 through 15, just little tiny gains. And then serial happened, and podcasting has had this modern renaissance. And you see big gains year over year in awareness of the term podcasting here in America. But that number is far surpassed by 14 percentage points in Australia. As we kind of see in the States as well, though, relatively modest gains in consumption. So a 1 percentage point gain in have you listened to a podcast in the last month in Australia, a bigger percentage gain, a 30% gain from 10% to 13%, 3 percentage points in listening in the last week. So we see a bigger gain in having listened in the last week to a podcast in Australia, up to 13%. And that number actually trails the percentage we get in both the United States and Canada. And this has been, to me, one of the most intriguing findings of the study. This was the same thing we saw last year, where the awareness was higher and the consumption was lower. And the reason this really stands out to me is because those numbers are typically highly correlated. If you have that greater awareness, you're likely to have greater usage. Here, in this situation, there's much higher awareness of podcasting in Australia, but actually lower uptake and usage here on a weekly basis. It's also true on a monthly basis, as compared to what we get in the United States and Canada. I don't fully know the reasons why. The best theory that I have developed by talking to people is the awareness is being driven by your broadcast radio companies, both public and commercial, talking a lot about podcasting. Here in America, public radio talks a lot about podcasting, but commercial radio has been quite slow in promotion of podcasting. And so that might be a big factor in that awareness differential. And in terms of the consumption differential, it could be any number of things, probably less native content, and maybe as more Australian content is being produced by Australians for Australians, these numbers might catch up. And it could just be greater satisfaction with what people get from over the air, and so less impetus to listen to podcasts. But it'll be very interesting to track this over time and see how this changes. If someone does listen to a podcast in Australia, they tend to listen to a lot. The average was 5 listened to in the last week, and I'll point your eye towards that pink slice of the pie facing down. 10% of people who said they listen to any podcast say they had listened to 11 or more. And so as you probably know, certain people, when they get excited about podcasting, often will get really excited about it and listen to quite a lot. What do people listen on? Most people in Australia say they listen on their smartphone, 79% to 20% for a computer. Higher, it's very high for smartphone in the States, but higher in Australia. And where are they listening? So this is just where, have you ever listened to a podcast in each of these locations? 3/4 of people who've listened to podcasts say they've listened at home. The second biggest is in a car or truck. And again, that's ever having done it. And then the percentages for other locations. The car or truck will be the really interesting one to watch over time. Still today, for most people, in most cases, consuming a podcast in the car is a difficult experience. And it's not worth the hassle for many people. So it'll be very interesting to watch that and see if if it becomes easier, more convenient to do in the car. Will we see more consumption in the car here in the States, down in Australia, or anywhere? And we asked a new question this year. Do you ever listen to any podcast by Australian radio stations or Australian radio personalities? And 14% of people said yes. This was ever, not in the last month or last week. This will also be an interesting one to track over time. Finally, a couple other items. We looked at some social media. Social media usage up 2 percentage points from 80 to 82% of Australians saying that they've listened to a podcast in the, wow, okay. It's late here, it's past 10 p.m., that's where that came from. 82% saying they use social media at all, and over 90%, 12 to 54. What are they using? We got the exact same estimate year on year, 73% of Australians for Facebook last year and this year. Little bumps up for Instagram, but not a lot of changes actually for brand usage year on year. What I point out on this graph is down there at the bottom. Twitter, second from the bottom, 13% of Australians saying that they use Twitter. Twitter is so interesting because everyone talks about it and no one uses it. And it's exactly the same here in the States. Obviously, Twitter is always in the news, for better or for worse. I won't reveal my opinion. Our president is using Twitter constantly. And so Twitter is being talked about all the time, but the percentage of both Americans and Australians who say they use it is very, very modest. Isolating 12 to 24-year-olds, this graph is also interesting. You see there's really 3 main players. It's now nearly a 3-way tie. Facebook actually dropping a couple percentage points among young people. Instagram and now Snapchat, very close to making it a 3-way tie. Same story with Twitter down there at the bottom. And then here's a big change of great significance. What do you use the most often here in Australia? And while Facebook is still overwhelmingly what people say they use the most, a big drop from 73% last year to 60%. Now, the people at Facebook won't be too upset about this because the big gainer is their co-owned Instagram. But still a drop in even the combined total for those two from 81% to 74%. What went up? Snapchat a little bit, WhatsApp, Pinterest, etc. So a big change. Again, I don't mean to overstate the point. Facebook's still overwhelmingly what people say they use the most, but dropping in terms of being the most used social media brand. Finally, we looked at on-demand video and a big gain year on year for Netflix from 35% of Australians to 41%. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean the number of subscriptions because people can share subscriptions, etc. So now 50% of all Australians have a subscription to some on-demand video service. And what's really remarkable on this one is if you train your eye down there at the bottom on that 49 and 50, in particular that 50, 49% of Australians say they've used it in the last week. And that's really a remarkable ratio. Virtually everyone who says they have it say they've used it in the last week. Now it makes sense. You have it, you're paying for it, so you want to use it. People like it, so they use it. But to have that level of usage of, among the base of people who have presumably easy access to it is pretty amazing. So finishing up, just key takeaways. Broadcast radio, resilient and strong in the US and Canada, but even stronger in Australia. There's fewer options in your cars that people are using, so radio is a bit stronger there as well. Online audio, a growing and big factor in Australia, not quite what we see in North America. This interesting duality of podcasting being better known, but slightly less used as compared to here in the States. That will be fascinating to track over time. Smart speakers, a really exciting new factor, and we're seeing changes in in-home audio consumption here in the States already, and that will be something we're really going to want to watch in Australia going forward. And then all these new forms of digital media being driven by the smartphone and other things. Social media, obviously, YouTube, as I talked about, and Netflix. And I was walking down the street in New York City the other day and being blocked by a young man who was watching, presumably Netflix, or watching video as he walked down the street. I think the odds are not small that he's been run over and killed since I did that. But nonetheless, you see the level of attachment to video consumption. So that's a quick run through. I will now, before I sign off, try to see if there's any questions that I can try to take a stab at. Okay. Should we be overly concerned with radio? Okay, so a good question from someone in South Australia, and one of the states I've not yet been to. That's for my next visit. I'd love to get to Adelaide and visit South Australia. Should we be overly concerned as traditionally radio trends in Oz have followed the United States? Ian Wright. Hi, Ian. Thank you for asking that question. Well, I mean, there's the old adage from, I'm not going to think of his name, but the guy who was the CEO of Intel for many years. His name will come to me soon, the moment after I sign off. And his famous quote was, "Only the paranoid survive." And so I don't know that you should be overly concerned, but I think you can use the United States as an interesting test case. As radio in the States is very different. The two biggest players, or what were the two biggest players until recently, iHeart and Cumulus, are both going through bankruptcy right now. Bankruptcy in the States, I think, means slightly different from Australia. I think you would use the term are under administration as they try to work out their debt. But many American radio companies took out enormous amounts of debt, unsustainable amounts of debt, and that has affected some of their ability to develop and improve radio. Radio in Australia is much more personality driven than radio in the States, and I think that future-proofs radio in Australia a bit as compared to what we've seen in the United States. There's more investment in personalities, and there's people seem to listen more for personality radio in Australia than in the States. So I think that's something else to keep your mind on in terms of why radio is so much stronger in Australia than in the States. I think, frankly, I encounter more creativity when I listen to Australian radio and work with Australian radio. So all those reasons, I think, help explain why it's so much stronger. I actually think it also helps, to be honest, that you have fewer choices. A, so it's less competition, but B, more resources go into smaller pool, and you don't have that paradox of choice. There's so many choices, you just say, screw it, I won't listen to anything. So all those reasons. So my overly long answer is, sure, be paranoid and be concerned. But I think if Australian radio continues to do a lot of the good things it's doing, it should thrive and survive for many, many more years. People like radio, and they don't just listen out of habit. And that doesn't mean they can't find time or switch some of their time to other options as well. So that's my answer to that very good question. And I think I'll sign off at this point. I do want to emphasize, if you want to reach us, you can email us. Oh, we have it blinking again, so maybe a new one came in. One quick second, everybody. Anything important here? No. So if you do have questions, you can email us at info@edisonresearch.com. You can go to our website, edisonresearch.com. I'm always happy to talk audio of any kind, radio, devices, smart speakers, social media, you name it, with any of you. So I'd love to hear from any and all of you if you want to reach out. Again, the deck is on our website if you want to download it. And with that, I will say goodbye. Thanks so much for listening, and enjoy your Thursday.